Woodlawn Church. My name is Braden Henson. I am Pastor Brad's son, if you can't tell by the looks. But we're going to lead you.
You are a good-looking thing.
Oh, goodness. That's not where I thought that was going. But we're going to lead you on a song today.
I've heard 1,000 stories of one thing you're like, and I've heard the tender whisper of love, the dead of night, and you tell that you're pleased and that I'm never alone. You're good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are. And I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. I've seen many searching for answers, far and wide, but I know we're all searching for answers. Only you provide, 'cause you know just what we need before I say a word. You're a good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are. And I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. 'Cause you're perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us. 'Cause you're perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us. Oh, it's love so undeniable, I can hardly speak the peace so unexplainable. I can hardly think as you come, deeper still as you come, deeper still as you come, deeper still into love, love, love. You're good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are. And I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. You're a good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are. And I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. You're a good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are. And I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am.
Let me start by saying this. I want you to think through this with me, okay? Sometimes in American Christianity, we are very focused on what our faith means to us. So especially from the heritage from which I came, we talked about a personal walk with God or a personal testimony or your personal faith, your one-on-one thing, like you and Jesus. Like everything was very much about God and me, or you and God, or you and God, or you and God. And people would even wear t-shirts that say things like, God said it, I believe it, that settles it, that kind of thing. Like it's just me and him. My favorite joke to that is, it doesn't really matter whether or not you believe it, God said it, that settles it. So though it doesn't, the middle part of the t-shirt doesn't really matter at all. But anyway, here's the reality. As we read the Old Testament, we find that these people, these men and women of faith, saw their faith as much less of an individualistic thing. Like it's just me and my faith, or me and my God. They saw it much more of a communal thing, we and our God, and much more of a legacy thing, what God does in my life and how it affects my children and my grandchildren and my grandchildren's children. See what I'm saying? In other words, they saw themselves more as a link in a chain that lived throughout eternity, versus just an individual who's on a walk with God, or an individual who's on a journey with God. And so today we get to peer into the life of Abram and his wife Sarai. And those of you who have been around the Bible a little bit, you know that later on in the scripture, God changes their name to Abraham and Sarah. So if I make the mistake today and I call them Abraham and Sarah, you know who I'm talking about. We just haven't gotten to the name change part yet. So Abram and Sarai are this amazing couple that God does phenomenal things with. In fact, Abram himself is such an important character in human history that 3 of the world's largest religions base themselves on him. Not just someone like him or someone from his area, but him. Literally, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all trace themselves back to this guy, Abram. And we're going to learn some interesting things about him today. Some very interesting things. I want to ask you this question before we start reading the scripture. Have you ever thought that your life is so jacked up, so messed up, so screwed up, that in no way whatsoever could God do anything great with you? You're just hoping maybe that God might see fit to save you and let you into heaven. Okay? Here's the thing. I guarantee you that your life is no more askew than the life of this man Abram that we're about to read about today. Absolutely no more messed up at all than him. And God uses him in this great legacy building kind of way to literally change the world. Okay? Let's pray together and then we're going to read the scriptures. Jesus, open our ears to your word today. Open our eyes as we follow you and listen to you. Help us to see that you are a life-changing God, that you are a life-altering God, and that you are a legacy-building God. We need you because we can't do any of these things without you. Lord, the truth is we would not even desire these things without you. So thank you for giving us the desire to walk with you, to be used by you, and to change the lives of generations in front of us. Thank you for the desire for that, Lord, but then also thank you for the power for it to be true. And thank you for the opportunity for us to make choices and steps today that you can use to greatly affect those who will follow us. In your name we pray. Amen. The Bible continues to include, as we read through Genesis, these genealogies. And the genealogies can be a little cumbersome. They can be a little challenging to read. Sometimes it can seem even a little boring. But we learned even last week, right, that the reason why God includes this person's name and the next generation and the next generation and the next generation is that each individual matters to God. And he knows their name, just like he knows yours. It also shows us that not only do individuals matter, but chain link from one generation to the next of legacies matter to God. And he walks that legacy through, showing us how his grace and mercy moves through a generation to the next. So even as we read these genealogies, just think about how God can use you in the lives of those who follow you and who follow them and who follow them, okay? Let's read together. These are the genealogies of Shem. If you remember, Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? So we're going to read Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We're going to read these. When Shem was 100 years old, he fathered Arpachshad, 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived after he fathered Arpachshad 500 years and had other sons and other daughters. When Arpachshad had lived 35 years, he fathered Shelah. And Arpachshad lived after he fathered Shelah 403 years and had other sons and daughters. Verse 14 says, when Shelah had lived 30 years, he fathered Eber. And Shelah lived and fathered Eber 403 years later and had other sons and other daughters. When Eber had lived 34 years, he fathered Peleg. And after Eber had lived, he fathered Peleg 430 years and had other sons and daughters. When Peleg had lived 30 years, he fathered Reu. And Peleg lived after he fathered Reu 209 years and had other sons and other daughters. When Reu lived, see, this is just continuing, had lived 32 years, he fathered Serug. And Reu lived after he fathered Serug 207 years and had other sons and other daughters. Then in we are at verse 22 here. Sorry, there we go. When Serug had lived 30 years, he fathered Nahor. That's an important name. You want to remember Nahor. And Serug lived after he fathered Nahor 200 years and had other sons and other daughters. When Nahor had lived 29 years, do you notice how each of the first-time fathers seem to be getting slightly younger? Like with their first kid, they get slightly younger, just a little bit younger. It wasn't too many pages ago, we were reading genealogies that had people having their first child and they were hundreds of years old. And now their first child's coming about when they're 29. There's some thought as to why that is, but just something to notice. Verse 24 says, when Nahor had lived 29 years, he fathered Terah. You want to remember Terah. Nahor and Terah, those are important guys. He fathered Terah, and Nahor lived after he fathered Terah 119 years. Do you also notice the people are dying quicker? Okay, so it was at one time we're reading a genealogy and they're 200 or 300 years when they have their first child, and then they're 900 years when they die. And now we're having a child at 29 and dying at 119. That actually sounds fairly similar to the current lifespan. Like we're pretty close there, okay? He lived 29 years. He fathered Terah, and Nahor lived after he fathered Terah 119 years, and he had other sons and other daughters. Verse 26, this is an important one. When Terah had lived 70 years, he's a little older here, he fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. 3 brothers. Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now, these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran fathered Lot. So a brother to Abram named Haran had a son whose name is Lot, okay? Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred in the of the Chaldeans. So now we have one of Abram's brothers has died. He already has a son and they still live in okay, at this point when things are developing. And Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren. She had no child. That's an important part of the story as we read along and continue forward. So here's what happens in verse 31. Terah, this is Abram's father, okay? Terah takes Abram, his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, so his grandson, Abram's nephew, okay, is his grandson. And he also took Sarai, his daughter-in-law, and his son, Abram's wife, and they went forth together from of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Now, that's a little tricky because I just told you that his passed away son's name was Haran. Most scholars believe they settled in a city and named it after the brother who had just died. Okay, that's what most people would put this together. So we're not settling in a city that was already necessarily there, or if it was already there, it didn't necessarily have that name. He settles in a city and it's named after the son who's just passed away. Okay? When they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So I'm going to stop for just a second and make sure we're following along here. Okay? So we have the descendants of Shem so following Noah, and all of those steps from one generation to the next, leading up to the grandfather and the father, and then Abram, okay, and his two brothers, one of whom passes away, leaving his son as the heir to his family right. And so he and Abram go with their dad out of Ur of the Chaldeans and toward the promised land, landing in a city called, named after the brother, okay? We there together? You kind of get where we're going with this? It's an interesting group of things developing. And keep in mind, this storyline affects Christians, Jews, and Islam, folks who worship Islam. That entire, all three religions go back to this guy and this story and this journey. It's that big of a deal. Just to give you a little insight as to what we're talking about here, if you'll notice, that would be to your right. The Chaldea is in the area near Babylon. Let me give you a little backstory. That's going to be very close, maybe even exactly the same place as where the Tower of Babel would have been built. It's certainly very close to there. The people from there would have been descendants of those who built the Tower of Babel and tried to do all of the things that we talked about over the last couple of weeks. So this later then becomes Babylon, who's kind of the primary negative country in the juxtaposition between them and Israel in the future. And ultimately, it's now Iraq. Okay, so this is all of that area. Very interesting. When I first looked at the map, I thought, why in the world did they leave the Chaldean area trying to go to the promised land, which is just north of Egypt? Why didn't they just cut straight across? I don't understand why they went all the way up north and then all the way back down. That seems to us like a little bit out of the way. Well, then all you have to do is zoom in on a little Google Earth, and what you're going to find is all of that yellow area that you're seeing is a blend of impassable mountains and deserts. So there's no way to just grab a few camels and cut across the shortcut. That's not happening, okay? What they did was they followed the trade route up the Euphrates River and then followed down the trade route, which by this map you can see the green areas. That's to indicate to you that's in a lower land place where trees are growing and water is plentiful and transportation is possible, okay? So that's why they went from there to there. We live in a world where sometimes it's hard to get from one place to the next. I used to pastor a church in Mayfield. Did you know that to go from Mayfield to Nashville, you have to go to Grand Rivers? It seems really strange. Like, why would you drive north nearly an hour to get to a place where you could then drive south for 2 hours? But for the most part, people who live in Mayfield going to Nashville go right by Grand Rivers on Interstate 24 to do so. I tried cutting through one time. Mistake. There are roads down there in that part of Tennessee that are only there for tractors wider than the roads. You get stuck behind one of those things and you're going to be there for hours. I now understand why those from Mayfield go through Grand Rivers to get to Nashville. That's exactly the kind of thing that's happening in this story, okay? But in the story, even though the father of Abram may have set out to eventually end up in the promised land, what we call the promised land, the Canaanite land, even though he may have intended to end there, what happens is he stops in a town in the north end and he names it Haran after his brother. And they spend a significant amount of time there, okay? Let's keep going. I'll make some of these points here in just a minute. As I read now in Genesis chapter 12, we're going to get into the real details about Abram, okay? Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred." So Abram's father left his country, but he took his kindred with him. All of his family traveled with him. Now Abram's being told, leave your country and your family. Leave it all. I'm sending you to somewhere new. We'll find out why, by the way, in a minute. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. and I will bless you and make your name great. I want you to remember that for later. The two promises are, I will make you a great nation and I will make your name great. Those are two very important promises that you've actually heard those topics come up before in Genesis, okay? He said, ultimately, I'll make your name great so that you will be a blessing. So there's two promises. God's going to make him a great nation. God's going to give him a great name. And then God's going to give him a great purpose. And the purpose is for him to be a great blessing to the rest of the world. That's ultimately what's going on here. In verse 3, he says, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all of the families of earth shall be blessed. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot, that was his nephew of his brother who had passed away, his son, Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. There's a little background there that we don't quite know exactly. Scholars kind of differ on opinions as to how old was Abram when he left Ur the Chaldeans, and how old was he when he arrived at Haran, and how old was he when he left there. Okay? There's some other interesting twists in all this. For instance, we find out several chapters later in Genesis that Sarai's family is from Haran. That's the place where her father lived. It's the place where her brother lived. And so some scholars would say, well, maybe he meets Sarai while he's in Haran. The problem with that is that it seems to say in the previous chapter that he was married to her when they left Ur. Okay, so there's a bunch of interesting things going on there that we'll kind of work through and sort out as we do this. So Abram went. I love this, verse 4. So God has told him, you need to go where I'm going to tell you to go. But as of now, God has not told him where he's going. Okay? We've not heard any destination at this point. Another point that you're going to learn in a second is important. It says that Abram went, Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And then in verse 5. And Abram took Sarah his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. It's what other parts of the scripture call the promised land, okay? The land of Canaan. Now, keep in mind, who is Canaan? Okay, Canaan was a previous member of the story, and his descendants have been cursed. And ultimately, in the process, now they inhabit this land, but they're not doing God's will with this land at all. And the Lord is about to do great things to move God's people into the land that God wants them to be in over the next many generations. It's all part of this legacy building that God is doing through the story of Abram, okay? I'll keep reading. They set out to go to the land of Canaan, and when they came to the land of Canaan, in verse 6, it says that Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak at Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Okay? Verse 7. There we go. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So Abram built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And in verse 8 it says, from there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai or Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going on toward the Negeb. Wow. Lots of important and interesting things happening here, even as we just read through the text. In Joshua, just a few books of the Bible later, we hear this interesting thing about God's people. Joshua says, and this is going to be a shocker here for a lot of us. Joshua said to all the people, thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, he says, long ago, your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates. Okay, that's Ur and Haran are both beyond the Euphrates. Terah, the father of Abraham and of Nahor, that's his grandfather. And they served who? Read this with me. Other gods. They served other gods. Then I took, God is saying, then I took your father Abram, or Abraham in this case, from beyond the river, and I led him through all of the land of Canaan, and I made his offspring many. Let's go back to the map. I want you to understand a couple of realities here. God finds a descendant of Noah through Shem, his son, many generations later, who is the son of a pagan idol worshiper and the grandson of a pagan idol worshiper living in a pagan idol worshiping city, having left a pagan idol worshiping city to travel to ultimately the land of Canaan. And God calls that man out of that world to become literally one of the top 3 or 4 human beings in all of history as far as how their life affected everybody else. Isn't that ridiculous and beautiful at the same time? Isn't that amazing? Now listen, here's the challenge. A lot of us want to get kind of wound up on how bad our life is and how that must mean that God can't do anything great with us. Like, you don't understand, man. You don't understand the mistakes I've made. You don't understand the mess I've made of it. Have you seen my track record? You don't understand the things I've gone through or the horrible choices I've made or the people I've hurt. You don't understand any of all that. God could never use me. Well, he used a young man reared in paganism. Get this. I think this is really an interesting thing you'll remember. The god that they worshiped was most likely the moon goddess. And her name? Sin. S-I-N. Yeah, isn't that an interesting term? Most likely, both in the Babylonian area and in the Haran area, all of that area, archaeology has discovered now that in this time period, they were worshipers of the moon goddess Sin. Now, I don't want to freak people out. Like, some people would see things like the moon goddess Sin as just like a made-up deity, like it's nothing, okay? Maybe. I tend to think that we're talking more here about fallen angels, or as we would call them, demons, that posturize themselves as some sort of deity to the people, and the people began to worship. So these people groups, in my opinion, were not just making up a fakeness and calling it a god. They were actually worshiping something that was real. It just wasn't a deity. Right? We see that in other parts of the Old Testament where those who are pagans have these powers and these abilities to do what seem to be magical and miraculous things. They're not doing that by the power of some human. They're doing that by the power of the enemy, right? So we're literally talking here about a man who was raised in a family, according to my opinion, where his dad and his granddad worshiped a demon whose name was Sin. Right? And God calls this young man out of that story. Keep in mind, I don't want to give you too big of a push into the hurry into the future, but keep in mind that not long after the text we're reading today, Lot, that nice little nephew that he's taking with him, that's going to be this great partner in this new life that they're coming up with to follow God and honor him, Lot ends up hanging out in Sodom and Gomorrah and loving it. Right? This is the world in which Abram was raised. It's the reality of everywhere he looks in his family tree. And God calls Abram out of that. Don't tell me God can't call you out of where you are. Don't tell me God can't overcome some challenge that you're facing. Don't tell me that God sees you as a lost cause. Because you're far from, we don't normally encourage you to compare yourself to other human beings, okay? But just for a moment, I just want to ask you, did your daddy worship Satan? Grandpa worship Satan? Teach you to worship Satan? Did you guys sing songs to Satan? Enjoy sin as your God? Like, see what I'm saying? Like, this guy's been called out of this world, and you can be called out of yours. we can be called continually. Even after following Jesus and becoming a Christ follower, even the mistakes, the challenges, the bumps in the road that we experience, God's calling is great enough to change our complicated past. Okay? Let me read this to you from Luke chapter 7. Maybe you remember the story of Stephen, who was a deacon in the early New Testament church, who was stoned and killed by Jewish leaders because of his stance on Jesus. In that story, as he's about to be stoned, Stephen says this, brothers and fathers, get that. That's still a legacy building kind of language right there, okay? Brothers and fathers, hear me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, which, by the way, would include Ur and Haran. That's all Mesopotamian land. Before he lived in Haran, so on his way there or while he was still at Ur. And he said to him, go out from your land and from your kindred and go into the land that I will show you. We just read that. That's a quote from what we just read. Then he went out from the land of the Chaldeans, and he lived in Haran. And after his father died, God removed him from there into this land in which you are now living. Yet he gave to him no inheritance in it, not even a foot's length, but he promised to give it to him as a possession and to his offspring after him, even though he had no child. Abram didn't have anything to offer, and God promises him, and God makes good on his promises. So bring me whatever you want to bring me. Tell me whatever backstory you have. Bring to us whatever challenges you face, whatever limitations. If you found yourself at the bottom of the barrel, if you found yourself depressed, filled with anxiety, suicidal, addicted, whatever it is that if you've been lonely, you've been ostracized, you've been kicked aside, you've lost all human value in your own mind, I want you to understand this, that it all changes when God changes you. It all changes when God changes you. We've got to get the idea of us changing ourselves out of our mind and realize that none of that matters until God changes us. It all changes when God changes you. So brothers and sisters, I want to ask you the question, has God changed you? Is God still changing you? What changes does God have in store for you? These are all the things that we have an opportunity to be a willing participant in what God is doing in our lives. Let's look at a few things here. I love this. In our world, we have a tendency to measure someone based upon where they end up, don't we? We say things like, oh, I hear your daughter's dating a new young guy. He's a doctor. Good for you. Good for you. That's awesome. You know, or oh my gosh, I saw the new house that you bought. It is so beautiful. It's in a cul-de-sac. It's awesome. We like to celebrate where people end up, right? And we like to judge ourselves when we don't end up where we thought we wanted to end up or where we hoped we might end up. But in this story, the focus is not on where he ends up. The focus is on where God found him. Think about this. If the real big issue is not how did you make right and how did you accomplish big and how did you get it done, if that's not the point, if the point is where did God find you, what did God change in your life, what did God do by God's power, under God's authority, with God's strength, then we must remember that God is often concerned more with our internal progress than our external prosperity. Are you following me there? See, this is a big picture that we see throughout all of the early chapters of Genesis. Humanity prospers if you only look at the external. Humanity goes from being in a garden with just a man and a woman to then populating large portions of the earth. Humanity is then set back by a flood where all but 8 of them are killed. And only a few chapters later, they're building a great city with a tower into the sky. What progress they made. All external, which is why God looked at their external progress, their external prosperity, and he looked into them saying, no, you don't understand. I'm trying to build internal progress in you. I'm not trying to make you better at your job. I'm trying to make you better at humanity. I'm not trying to make you more successful financially. I'm trying to make you more filled with love so that whatever you have, you use it in the right way. Okay? Now, the fact that I use the word prosperity is because it was the best word that means success that starts with a P. I meant to compare it to progress internally. This isn't really intended to say yay or nay to financial prosperity. That's not really the issue. I'm not saying God wants you wise and poor. Not saying that at all. Truth is, in many cases, if God makes you wise, you will not be poor. Right? You'll handle things pretty well. Okay, so that's not what I'm saying. I am saying that the judge of a man or a woman in our world should start with internal progress and not focus so much attention on external prosperity. Men with daughters, would you rather your daughter marry a man with a blue-collar job who loves her like a queen and would give his life for her? Or would you rather her marry a man who's wealthy as can be and treats her like junk? See what I'm saying? Everybody makes the same decision there. We want those we love to be loved and treated well and cared for. This is about internal progress, God working in us to become the people that he wants us to be. Another thought here, we don't always want to look at where somebody finishes, but we want to pay attention to where God found them. This is the life story that's so amazing. So here's what I'm getting at. I've been a pastor almost 30 years. We'll celebrate 30 years here before long. In the process of that, I can remember being a young guy, and I thought, okay, here's a great testimony right here. Here's a great testimony. A great testimony is when someone meets Jesus and then gets successful and then lives a happy life and everything's awesome. All of that happens after they meet Jesus, right? My focus at that time is all about the progress they make and the prosperity they build after some sort of a salvation experience. See, my mind wasn't at that time going at all to where they were when God found them. I wasn't thinking at all about the addiction they might have had when God found them, about the trauma they may have experienced when God found them, about the family junk they might have inherited when God found them. But when you read the story of Abram, you can't skip over all of the things that make him who he is when God called him. Because over the next 24 or so years, even before he is circumcised, we'll get that in a later chapter, before he technically becomes a Hebrew, 20-something years of Abram just trying to figure out walking with God and not being his dad or granddad or family. Does that make sense? See, it's important that we get this. We don't just want to look at where somebody finishes and judge their life on that. We want to remember where God found someone. And you should do this in your own life. So many of us want to look in a mirror and then pay attention to our neighbor and go, oh my gosh, the man or the woman I see in the mirror is not as successful as the man or woman who I see in the next yard. But we don't pay attention to whether or not the man or the woman in the next yard started in the same place the man or woman in the mirror did. You have to pay attention to where God found you. If you don't pay attention to where God found you, you will judge yourself more harshly than you should as you see him bringing about the internal progress that he's seeking to find in you. That will ultimately contribute in some way to the external prosperity that he would love to have for you. Am I making sense? It all starts with the internal progress, and that can't be discussed without remembering where you were when the Lord found you. So let's talk about a few things here. I'm a Kentucky basketball fan. One of the things that I enjoy watching year-round is recruiting, okay? If you know what the term crystal ball means, then you know exactly what recruiting, you do what I do. I find out about a player, I find out his name, I find out which AAU, which means fancy high school ball, he plays for, and then I go and find out his crystal ball. His crystal ball is, what do the experts say about his potential as a player at the college level? And from that, sportscasters and organizations come up with this 5-star rating process where if you're really, really awesome in high school, but probably not going to be much even at a small college, then you're a 1-star recruit, you know? But if you are the kind of player, male or female, who in high school nobody can touch you, like you're scoring 50 points a game and nobody can get close to you, and when they look at your skill set, they know that you are going to be a first-round NBA draft pick after 1 or 2 years of college, then they call you a 5-star recruit. You've got it all, right? You've got it all. What I want to be very clear with here is that Abram was not a 5-star recruit. He was not a 5-star recruit at all. Had he been recruited by a coach at a major basketball university, the fan base would have been quite upset with that choice. Like, seriously? You chose like a 5'1" white dude with a 3-inch vertical to play basketball on our team? Like, I don't understand what you're doing here at all. Get this, I've already mentioned it, I want to get it again. He was from a pagan family. The only teaching he had received about God was from people who taught him to worship things that were demonic and untrue, okay? He didn't have any good basis for that at all. He was old. Now, listen, I'm old, so let's be clear. I got lots of gray. If you've ever thought that I looked younger one day, it's because my salon colored it up and got it looking better. Like I'm old, okay? I get that. If you are old like me, don't be offended by what I'm about to say here, okay? Because I get that, right? But God was taking this man and saying, through your offspring, I'm going to build a great nation and make your name great. And he was 75 and had no children. Do you understand how that's not who you pick? You know, so if you need a man to make a whole bunch of babies and just bless the whole world with great children, you typically pick the younger buck, right? You don't pick the old guy who doesn't have any children. Like, you don't do that. That's what God did. His wife was barren. I don't even like saying the word barren. It's Old Testament language. It's definitely not a word we would use in that way in our world. Here's what I want you to understand that means. In a culture where oftentimes women were valued for their ability to be a wife and mother, when a woman had no children, even though she had been married for an extended period of time, the culture had a tendency to say, God must not like her. God must be cursing her. Something's wrong with her if she hasn't had children. Now, I'm going to chase just a rabbit for a second and say, our culture does not do that to women as a whole now, but sometimes the enemy still speaks that way to women. So if you've had a friend or if you've experienced this yourself where you desperately wanted a child or maybe another child, or you had experienced either an inability to conceive or a constant miscarriage or something like that, then you can probably feel some of the pain that Sarai felt. Hers might have been even more so exaggerated by the fact that other women would have been pointing and laughing at her. Make sense? Other men would have seen her as a lesser quality wife because of this. It's brought up not to put Sarai down. The Bible does not mention that she was barren because the writer of the Bible is going, yeah, what a not so good lady. That's not the point. The point is to show that through a woman who on her own abilities and by her own physical skill set could not produce a child, God is about to bring about life that's going to bless the whole world. So the fact that she's barren is being mentioned here just to show us that she and her husband were not the choice that humanity would have made, but God can take anybody from anywhere and do anything, okay? And that's what he's about to do here. He was also nomadic. In other words, he's from a place, but he lives in another place and he's heading to another place. The guy has no roots, right? He's just moving around, all these things. All of that makes him not the person you would think to begin a legacy that changes the whole world. But this is the reality of the man God chose. And I love this. As we read about it, I told you earlier, something we just kind of discovered as we were praying through this. Do you notice that God promises Abram everything that Babylon wanted? By Babylon, I mean those who built the Tower of Babel. Do you remember last week and the week before we talked about there were two things they wanted. They wanted a great city and they wanted a great name. A great city and a great name. The problem was they wanted to do it without God. Make me powerful, make me popular. I want to be powerful and popular, but I want to do so separate from God. And in this case, because of God, and only because of God, Abraham had no ability to do it on his own. God says, I will promise you, I will make you a great nation. I will make your name great. Everything those other people wanted, I will take away from them because they wanted to do it without me, and I will do it for you so that because of me, you become what they wish they could have been. A great nation and a great name. This is the reality of what's happening in Abram's life here. It's just a beautiful, beautiful thing, I think. Let's take it back for a second. So Abram begins something that God's going to deal with called the Abrahamic covenant. We'll deal with that in the next 2 weeks, where God makes promises to Abram that are unlike anything God has promised to others. And in a very specific way, we now have not a two-way covenant where there is, I'm going to do this for you, but I need you to do this for me, like conditional kind of things. We're now about to see a covenant that in the next week or two where we're going to see God saying, I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to do this for you. And end of sentence, period, done. I'm going to do this through you, with you, for you. We see this one-way kind of love. But before that, let's just remember a few of the things that human beings have done to try to overcome the curse in their own life. You have Adam who worked. He worked. We have Eve who experienced painful childbearing. You have Abel who brought a portion of his take off the land to worship God, to worship God. Then you have Cain who strikes out in anger to try to get what he wants and overcome, and he kills his brother. Then you have this awesome mention of Enoch who walked with God and God took him home to be with the Lord without human death. Then you have a lot of people who just keep living and keep dying, and they keep living and they keep dying. And then you have people like the Nephilim who seem to grow strong and tall and try to make what they wanted with the world they had. Noah then builds a boat just to kind of escape judgment, but then he builds an altar to worship the God who saved him. Then the Babylonians, they built a tower to try to reach heaven and overcome God's power with their own. And God spread them out throughout the entire world. But now, God says to Abram, the way we overcome sin is a one-way promise from me to you. I will make you a great nation. I will make your name great. That's how a legacy happens. God makes a promise, and then mankind responds with faith. That's how it happens. So let me ask you this. You ever find yourself in a place, this is kind of a practical question. I think it's interesting in this story that God says to Abram, come follow me. And kind of in parentheses, and I'm not going to tell you where you're going, you're just following me, okay? You ever had anybody do that to you? Follow me, where are we going? Just follow me. Follow me, where are we going? Just follow me. It's a little unsettling, isn't it? Like, I don't really know if I want to follow you, right? Okay, not long ago, there was a situation here where somebody came to pick up a gift we were giving them, and it was kind of dark in the gymnasium, the COC, and it was a young woman, and I said, it's in the kitchen, come with me. And I could see on her eyes, she's like, dude, I don't know you. I'm not walking into a dark room with you. I don't care if you're a preacher or whatever. I could care less. No, I'm not going in there with you, no. And I recognize that's fair. Like, okay, I'm so sorry. That is totally fair. You stay here. I'm going to go turn the lights on so that you can see where you're going. And then if you feel comfortable, you can come with me. And she went, okay, that's great. And so she stood on one side of the gym. I turned the lights on the other, and she went in. That's kind of what Abram was being asked to do here is I want you to follow me. I'm not telling you where I'm going. Now, here's the reality for us. This is just break it down to human personality types for just a second. Some of us are people who trust a person, and some of us are people who trust a strategy or a map or a game plan. You can do it this way. Some of you use the GPS. Some of you want to see the map, right? Some of you like the compass. It just goes, that's north. Let's go there. Okay, great. Just keep going. Some of you are like, no, I need more detail than that. I need you to tell me which steps we're taking. For those of you younger than me, you won't remember this, but we used to go on vacation. We would go to AAA and we would print out this booklet. And this booklet had 20 miles on every page. And you would flip to the next page and you would have the next 20 miles. And here's what's crazy about the page. There was no little blue dot that told you where you were. You're like, how did you possibly use that? You paid attention to the details of where we're going. I think this is real, okay? What I'm about to say, I think is very real. I think a lot of us struggle with trusting God when he won't tell us what he's going to do. We trust following him when he won't show us where he's going to take us. We want to trust the strategy. So like, God, just paint me a picture of what you're doing. Show me how this works out. Give me the next 7 steps. And then, Lord, I will happily take those steps with you. Right? The problem is, and you got to be kind of honest with yourself here for a second. The problem is that we have a tendency to want to make sure we know what God's about to do with us to see whether or not we like the outcome before we decide to say yes, so that ultimately we're still in charge. Make sense? This is why we're told that God calls Abram to follow him and does not tell him where he's headed. So folks, this is the truth. We have to trust God more than you trust the game plan. You have to. You have to trust the Spirit more than you trust the strategy. There's no way around it. I wish I could make it nicer and easier, but that's the truth. You will not have much fortune in following God if you make him tell you the strategy before you'll follow the Spirit. Okay? You won't. Because oftentimes he's simply not going to tell you. Not going to tell you. Trust God more than you trust the game plan, or in another way of saying it, trust the Spirit more than you trust the strategy. And as we kind of close out some things here, if you want to build a legacy, you have to recognize that something that happens here with Abram is Abram doesn't run from his complications. He runs to his calling. Let's think about this for a second. We see Abram leaving trouble. He leaves trouble in Ur of the Chaldeans. He leaves trouble in Haran, and he runs to Christ. If you don't watch out, you will misunderstand what's happening. It's a tendency for us as human beings to go, I don't really know what's over there, but I know that what's over here is horrible. So I don't like this. So I don't really know what's over there or why I'm going over there or what I'm going to do over there, but I know I'm going to get out of this. Because this is not suitable to me. I don't like this. And the further I can get away from this, the faster I want to run to get over there. Here's the problem. When you're motivated by simply running from your complications, then you're not necessarily moving into some calling that God's given you. And what ends up happening for people over and over and over is that the same set of complications are waiting over there. You still got to deal with them. You still got to figure it out. A lot of times, folks, the complications are not outside of you, aiming at you. This is going to sting a little bit. A lot of times, the biggest complications are coming from within us. And so it doesn't really matter where our locale is, or who our best friend is, or what club we're in, or what church we attend. A lot of times, we bring our complications with us. Okay? We can't live in a world that just goes, I'm going to run from my complications. And we're not going to get to use Abram as our example and go, he lived among pagans and he got the heck out of there, you know. He got out of Dodge. He ran in the other direction from that stuff. He didn't want to be near the pagan stuff. Oh, that's true, but that's not why he left. He left because God called him to a specific place for a specific purpose. To make his name great, to make him a great nation, so that he could be a blessing to the whole world. So I'm going to encourage you, make sure that you are running toward God's call for your life and not just simply trying to get away from the things that complicate your life, because you're just going to step right into other complications. Okay? I'll close out with this. I think there's no doubt that God is working, is calling, and does desire to make great things happen through your life, for your life, and then extended beyond your life. There is no doubt that for whatever reason that you face what you face and deal with what you deal with, that God has a legacy-minded calling for you that means that you listen to him, see him, follow him in faith, and what he does from that is he builds up beautiful things, not just for you as an individual, but for those who watch you, for those who pay attention to you, for those who are born to you, for those who are your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. Get this, the legacy that God could be building through your current experiences and complications bring you to your calling in the future, which can not only have positive effects on your children, but on those they marry, on the children they have, on their friends, on their coworkers, on their neighbors, and other family members. This can also go in the other direction. It doesn't happen in this story, but I can't tell you the number of times that a 12-year-old meets Jesus and 10 years later we're baptizing her grandpa. See what I'm saying? This is a beautiful thing that God does through you. So right now, right here, right where we are, as you think about the complications you face in life, ask God where your calling is. Follow him through your complications, maybe and sometimes away from your complications, but ultimately to the thing or things or relationships or places or people that he's calling you to. Would you pray with me?